solve for in a zombie apocalypse?
Pardon me?
I'm sure we'll get there.
What was that?
What are you trying to solve for in a zombie apocalypse?
Well, that's the question. What are we trying to
Too
solve
many
for?
people.
What are we trying to solve for? Right. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Morrison Bellman here real quick, but I'm going to give you a quick timeline to see kind of what's going on in their world. Right? So basically, Communist Manifestos published in 1848, and revolution breaks out across Europe. Right? 1848, huge revolutionary year. Most of them fail.
Those were liberal, not so much communist revolution.
They were communists. They called themselves communists.
Really?
They called themselves communists. Or socialists, but mostly communists. All right, Paris Commune, 1871. It's the first time that it seems like there will actually be a revolution of the proletariat in Paris, because everything is in disarray at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. And believe it or not, the royals and the military just leave Paris. So everybody else who's left is like, hey, let's take over the city, right? And they do for a little while. And they set up their little communes, they set up their little anarchist structures, and then eventually the French government thinks, oh, hey, we should go take care of that, right? And the whole thing collapses. This is the great crisis for all revolutionaries in the 19th century. We got this fucking close, and we blew it. Why did we blow it? What will it take to get from point A to point B? From capitalism, oligarchy, whatever, to the new world. What will it take, right? How will it happen? So, shortly thereafter, William Morris gets involved with the Radical Union in England, which is, one of the early communist organizations. And in 1884 founds the Socialist League, which is one of the first anarchist organizations, right? So these.
Splitter. I said splitter.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, dude, there's a lot around that. Anyway, Haymarket riots in Chicago, here in the United States, in 1886. Anarchists at work throwing bombs, riots break out. It's very turbulent times, is the message here, right? From 1848 to 1917, 60 years, right? A lot of shit is happening. In the midst of this, Looking Backward comes out in 1888. News from Nowhere, 1890. Now, what would you think, just looking at that sequence there from 1888 to 1890? Think there's any coincidence there that one follows the other? It is not a coincidence. That's the great thing, right? So, in fact, William Morris wrote News from Nowhere in response to Looking Backward. So Looking Backward was published in 1888. It was the third best-selling novel in the United States after Uncle Tom's Cabin and Ben-Hur, selling 400,000 copies. This had to be every literate person in the United States. It was so revolutionary and such a big deal that it spawned its own utopian movement called nationalism. And the reason it's called nationalism is really socialism, but socialism had a bad tinge to it because of all that other stuff that happened. But the idea was we would form this utopian world where capitalism would advance to its most perfect state. We would have this giant state monopoly and this giant centralized distribution system. And everybody, all of us, would have to serve our time in the industrial army. But once we were out of the industrial army, it's all good living, right? So this came to be called nationalism because it was about nationalizing all industries.
This is also the Bellamy salute, correct?
I don't know.
Also known as the Nazi salute, I believe.
I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
No, that's a real, yeah, it's real.
No, I think that must be that's a different. This is an American. I think you're thinking of a British guy. He wasn't alive by that time. And at the time, there were over 160 Bellamy clubs in the United States. And the United States was like 30 states, right? That came into being to talk about this book and think about how to make it happen, right? So this was a real serious thing. This was actually going on, right? William Morris over in England, as the anarchist, reads this book and has a shit fit. He's like, this is terrible, right? And you'll see what he had to say about it here in a second. But basically, as the anarchist, he was like, how do you think that we can wind up in a better world if that better world is just the perfection of all the crap we have now, right? How do you get to that better place from here? How do you go from A to B? right? Morris's response is you can't, right? If that's how you think about things, you are just going to be perfecting the machineries of repression. If you really, really want to make a change, there has to be a radical break. There has to be something that at one stroke changes everything. All right? As I say here, he was a revolutionary socialist. He believed in revolution, not evolution. Right? This is about progression. This is about revolution. All right? So this is the dialogue. This is the big dialogue that's happening at the end of the 19th century. Which one of these guys is right? And which one is it going to be? Which path will we pursue? Right? Day of the Triffids, published in 1951. Any of you guys know anything about John Wyndham at all? He is like the Arthur, well, I wouldn't say Arthur C. Clarke, because Arthur C. Clarke is British. He is probably the most important British science fiction writer of the 1950s. But for various things having to do with the politics of science fiction, he's not well regarded in the canon. However, The Day of the Triffids is like required reading in British high schools. Right? And I know this because my paper on Wyndham gets like, I don't know, 300 hits a year. Obviously from kids in Australia and England doing their research papers. Right? Day of Triffids, published in 1951. He was among one of the first science fiction writers to be interested in the idea of systems, and specifically ecology. He actually mentions the word ecology for the first time in science fiction that I know of in The Kraken Wakes, which is from about 1950. And so he talks about ecology and how things interact, what systems are about. And Alex Garland, the author of the screenplay for 28 Days Later, cites The Day of the Triffids as a direct influence. So where is the connection then between all these guys, right? So Morrison versus Bellman. It's industrialism versus agrarian utopianism. It's rise of the state versus rise of the community. This is the dialectic that's being set up. And this question, how will the revolution happen? Steady advancement or radical break? And this is the quote from Morrison Bellman about how he just goes and talks about how can you think that you could get from point A to point B? If you conceive of the change to socialism as taking place without any breakdown of that life, or indeed disturbance of it, by means of the final development of the great private monopolies, which are such a noteworthy feature of the present day. So he's like, this is just going to happen. This is what Bellamy's assuming. This is what he's criticizing. Okay, back to Day of the Triffids. So here's the plot, right? Mutant genetic monsters unleashed due to human hubris. All right. So here's the stroke, right? If you read Morris, it's a civil war that breaks out, right? So we get to a certain point where the oppression of the proletariat is just too much. Various things happen. A civil war breaks out. Everybody's destroyed. There's almost no one left. From that, they rebuild this great agrarian utopian society. It's a corrupt clockwork world built on monopolies. Bill Mason, in the novel, talks about this extensively at the beginning, right? The disaster happens, he wakes up in the hospital, he wonders what's going on. Third chapter is the explanation. We lived in this corrupt world, driven by monopolies. We were all cogs in a machine. We went out and we manufactured these things called Triffids, which are these carnivorous plants, because we want to harvest them for their oil. And they put them on these great ranches full of Triffids, and they think they have tamed them, right? They chained them up, they dock their stingers, and they think they're tame, and they just march them off to be mulched.
Because they can move around.
Yes, because they can move around. And they may communicate. There's some speculation that they actually communicate, right? So we've manufactured these creatures, and we know they're dangerous, but we just ignore it.
Well, people have them in their gardens.
Yeah, they have them in their gardens. It's considered amusing to keep a pet Triffid, right? So what happens is, at the same time, there are these orbiting space weapons that we've decided to put into orbit for whatever reason. And one day, one of them goes off, leaving everybody on the planet blinded, except for a few people. the survivors. And then the Triffids get loose. And that's when the zombie apocalypse happens. Essentially, well, I'll talk about this more in a second too. Essentially, when we go from civil war to zombie apocalypse, we're just changing the content. We're not changing the structure, right? We want to get to the same place. It doesn't matter what gets us there. So, the world is destroyed at a stroke, resulting in civil war. And most importantly, he talks about the idea that ethics are not inherent, but they're situational. You change the system, you change the people. All right? But his real innovation, so most of the time you get into a utopian world, it's totality, right? It's all-encompassing. That's why utopias are almost always on islands, right? Because the idea is that the utopia is this all-encompassing thing. In the day of the Triffids, what happens? Little communities spring up with their own kinds of solutions to a particular problem. Does this sound a little familiar? What happens in The Walking Dead?
Okay.
What happens? What happens in 28 Days Later?
Oh.
And in the end, it's very interesting because in Day of the Triffids, the communities they go to represent sort of falling back on old ideas, right? So there's a kind of Christian community. There's being the isolated lord of the manor kind of community. There's a fascist feudalist society that springs up, and all of these become undone in one way or the other. It's only the people who decide to completely reform society and the way things are done who have some indication of success. 28 Days Later. So, spiral-wise progression of the myth. Civil war equals man versus man, right? Doesn't matter actually what the combatants are. You just need to wipe out a whole bunch of people at one time. Man versus genetic monster. The Triffids. Triffids are just a stand-in. Triffids are just another mechanism for civil war, which then creates the conditions that you really want to talk about, right? And then, 28 Days Later, man versus genetic monster man, right? The rage virus, right? Doesn't matter, right? We just need some way to get people against people, or something against people, to create the conditions for the Civil War, right? So, as we watch the movie, I'm done. The first thing I would ask you to think about is, what is the significance of the utopias that are in this tour? And what are they supposed to represent? And why don't they work? Okay? It has 3 alternate endings, which I hope we'll have time to watch. Utopias are hard to conclude, right? How do you end a utopian story? Normally you wake up and you go back someplace. But the kind of choices that get made at that ending are very important for fixing the reader's perspective on how to read what just happened. Right? So hopefully we'll watch the alternate endings. I'll ask you, how does that change the ultimate statement about utopia that's being made in here? And finally, the big question, why zombie apocalypse? What is it we're so obsessed about? Why do we need this story and these structures to think about something? And what is it we're trying to think about? So, now we can watch the movie.
Woo!